Don't, it still stings there, the rancher understood, and it shook the whole town. The kind of strength that came not from loud words or dramatic gestures, but from years of waking up before dawn, feeling the cold bite of the early morning air, and walking across fields that stretched farther than most eyes could see. He had lived in the small town of Cedar Creek all his life, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where doors stayed unlocked, and the rhythm of life was slow and steady, like the flow of the nearby river. The town itself was simple, a cluster of old wooden houses, a small general store, a post office that smelled faintly of letters and dust, and a single diner where the smell of coffee mixed with pancakes every morning. For Henry, this was home, and for him, home had always been about routine, responsibility, and the land that had been in his family for generations. Henry's ranch was a modest one by today's standards, but to him, it was everything. The land rolled gently, dotted with patches of oak trees and wide fields where cattle grazed peacefully. He woke up every morning before the sun rose, lit the stove in the old farmhouse kitchen, and brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the sleepiest bones. As he sipped his coffee, he looked out the window at the fields, noticing every detail: the way the frost clung to the grass in winter, the sound of birds returning in spring, the faint rustle of cattle moving through the paddocks. Life on the ranch was hard, yes, but it was honest work, and Henry had always believed in the dignity of it. The people of Cedar Creek admired Henry, though few knew him truly. He was respected because of his quiet fairness. If someone had a problem with their cattle or needed help fixing a fence, Henry was the first person they called. But he never boasted about his knowledge, never sought recognition. That was just how he lived, steady, dependable, and quietly kind. Children would sometimes follow him around the ranch, fascinated by the way he handled animals and worked the land. He never scolded them harshly, but instead taught gently, showing them the patience and care it took to tend to living creatures. And yet, beneath his calm exterior, there was a depth of feeling, a layer of life experience that most people never saw. One late autumn afternoon, as Henry finished repairing a broken fence post near the edge of the pasture, he noticed a car slowly driving down the dirt road toward his house. It was unusual to see strangers in Cedar Creek, especially ones who took the time to drive slowly as if they were studying every detail. Henry wiped his hands on his shirt and watched as the car stopped near the gate. A woman stepped out, carrying a small notebook in her hand. She looked around as if she were searching for something or someone. There was a cautious air about her, but also a quiet determination. Henry felt a small pang of curiosity. The woman introduced herself as a journalist, though she didn't sound like the kind who chased sensational stories. She explained that she had heard about an old incident in Cedar Creek, a story that had faded from memory but had left traces in the town's history. Henry felt a shiver run down his spine. He had not thought about that incident in years. He had buried the memory deep inside, kept it locked away behind routine and quiet work. Yet, seeing this stranger standing before him, notebook in hand, he felt that old pain stir once more. Henry invited her to sit on the porch while he fetched some coffee. As they sat together, he looked out across the fields, watching the cattle slowly moving under the fading sunlight. The journalist asked gentle questions at first, small talk about the town and the ranch. But Henry could feel the direction of her curiosity shifting, like a breeze beginning to push at the edge of a door. When she finally asked about the incident, Henry's hand trembled slightly. He did not answer immediately. He stared at the horizon, remembering the young boy who had once come to the ranch, full of energy and laughter. A boy who had loved running through the fields, climbing trees, and exploring the small wonders of the land. Henry remembered the accident vividly, though it had happened many years ago. The boy had slipped, and though Henry had been nearby, he could not prevent it. The fall had left physical scars, yes, but it had also left invisible wounds, wounds that lingered in the boy's heart and in Henry's own. That day, Henry had promised himself he would never let such a tragedy happen again. He had spent the following years working harder, watching closer, and trying to make amends in ways he could, though the guilt never fully left him. Most of the townspeople had moved on, accepting that life held accidents and hardships. But Henry carried the memory like a quiet ache that never healed. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ranch, Henry felt the weight of years pressing down on him. He realized that hiding the story had not made it easier. It had only allowed the pain to linger quietly, shaping his life in ways others could not see. The journalist's presence, though unsettling, brought a strange sense of relief. Finally, someone was asking, someone was listening. And perhaps it was time to face the memory, not just for himself, but for the boy, for the town, and for the years of silence that had grown too heavy to carry alone. Henry began to speak, slowly at first, choosing his words carefully. He told small stories from the ranch, weaving in glimpses of the past without revealing everything at once. He spoke of mornings like this, when the light fell just right on the fields, when the cattle moved like shadows, when the wind carried the scents of earth and grass. The journalist listened, occasionally jotting notes, but mostly just letting him talk. And with every word, the tension inside Henry loosened slightly. The past was not forgotten, but it was no longer a secret locked tightly inside him. The day turned into evening, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. The journalist thanked Henry for his time and said she would leave soon, but she had one more question, a question that made Henry's stomach tighten. She asked him if he had ever told anyone the full story, if he had ever shared the truth of that day with the town. Henry shook his head slowly. No, he had not. The memory had always been his burden alone, but something inside him shifted. The quiet life he had built, the steady rhythm of work and routine, had protected him, yes, but it had also kept him from healing fully. Perhaps it was time to change that. Perhaps it was time to let the story be known, to allow others to see the man behind the rancher. That night, Henry sat on the porch long after the journalist left, staring at the darkened fields. The wind whispered through the trees, and the stars blinked faintly above. He thought of the boy, of the town, and of all the quiet years spent in reflection. He realized that life was fragile, shaped by moments both large and small, by choices made and those missed. And he understood that sharing the story, even in part, was not a betrayal of the past but a way to honor it, to bring light to something long hidden, to connect with the people around him in a new and honest way. As Henry finally went inside, the house feeling warmer than the cold night outside, he felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. He knew that telling the story would change things. It might shock the town, it might stir old feelings, it might even upset people. But he also knew it was the right thing to do. For the first time in years, Henry felt the stirring of courage, a quiet determination that he could face the past without being consumed by it. And in that moment, beneath the familiar roof of his family home, Henry understood that life on the ranch, simple as it seemed, had prepared him for this moment of truth, this chance to finally face the shadows of yesterday and allow a small, fragile hope to take root in the hearts of those around him. The morning after the journalist's visit, Henry woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight had barely touched the hills when he was already walking through the fields, boots crunching softly against the frost-covered grass. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like an echo. He could not stop thinking about the accident that had changed so many lives long ago. The memory, once buried under years of routine and quiet work, now rose to the surface with a force he had not felt in decades. It was as if the earth itself had remembered, whispering through the rustling leaves and the faint sound of cattle moving in the distance. Henry remembered the boy clearly. His name was Tommy, a bright, energetic child whose laughter had once filled the empty corners of the ranch with life. Tommy had been fearless in a way that most children were not, climbing trees that seemed too tall, running through the pastures without fear of obstacles, and exploring the boundaries of the ranch as if it were an endless playground. Henry had always admired that energy. But admiration turned to horror on that fateful afternoon. It was a warm spring day. Henry had been checking fences near the creek, ensuring that none of the cattle wandered too close to the water. Tommy had followed him, as he often did, curious and eager to learn. He had asked questions about everything: the way the water moved over rocks, the sound of birds hidden in the trees, and even the small insects crawling along the bank. Henry had laughed and tried to answer every question, but his attention had been divided. He had been thinking about repairs needed on the barn roof, about the upcoming cattle auction, and about the endless responsibilities that weighed on him as a rancher. In an instant, everything changed. Tommy slipped on a wet rock near the edge of the creek and fell. Henry had rushed forward, but he was too late. The boy's fall left a deep gash on his leg, and though the town doctor had treated the wound, the accident had left more than physical scars. Tommy's spirit had been shaken, and so had the town. People whispered and speculated, and though Henry was never blamed openly, he felt the invisible weight of responsibility pressing on him from every corner. He had tried to move on, tried to continue life as usual, but the memory of that day lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. As Henry walked through the fields that morning, he remembered the exact sounds of that day: the sudden splash of water, Tommy's cry, the heavy thump of him hitting the ground, and Henry's own heart pounding in panic. The memory was so vivid that it made his chest tighten. He could almost see Tommy's small face, eyes wide with fear and confusion. That moment, though it had happened years ago, had shaped Henry's life more than anything else. He had become more careful, more watchful, almost overprotective, and yet he had never spoken openly about it. The town had moved on, but Henry had carried the memory alone, silently bearing the burden of guilt and regret. The journalist's visit had stirred something in him. The questions she asked, though gentle, had forced him to confront what he had long avoided. He realized that the story he had kept hidden was not just his own. It was part of the town's history, part of the lives of everyone who had been touched by that accident. And most importantly, it was part of Tommy's life, which had been altered in ways no one fully understood. Henry understood then that he could no longer ignore the truth, that the memory, painful as it was, needed to be faced and shared. Henry decided to visit Tommy. The boy was now a young man, working at a small farm on the edge of town. As Henry approached the farmhouse, he felt a mix of anxiety and hope. What would Tommy say? Would he forgive, or would he still feel anger buried under years of silence? Henry took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Tommy opened it cautiously. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years had changed them both. Tommy's boyish face was now adult, marked by hard work and quiet determination, while Henry's once strong frame had grown leaner, and his hair carried streaks of gray. But the connection between them was immediate. The memory of that day, though painful, was still alive in both of them, waiting for acknowledgement. I wanted to talk," Henry began, his voice low but steady. "About that day years ago." Tommy studied him for a moment, eyes searching, and then stepped aside to let him in. The house was simple but welcoming. They sat at the kitchen table, cups of steaming tea in front of them. Silence hung in the air at first, heavy and awkward, but it was not unpleasant. It was the silence of two people preparing to face something important together. Henry began to speak slowly, recalling the events of that day without embellishment. He told Tommy about his own feelings, the fear, the guilt, and the helplessness he had felt. He admitted how much he had carried that burden silently, how it had shaped his actions and his thoughts for years. Tommy listened quietly, eyes fixed on Henry, absorbing every word. The story brought tears to both their eyes, though neither spoke at first. It was not an easy conversation, but it was honest, and for the first time in decades, the memory of the accident began to lose some of its sting. Tommy finally spoke. His voice was soft but steady. "I never blamed you, Henry. I was scared, yes. I hated that it happened. But I never held it against you. I needed time to understand it myself." Henry felt a wave of relief. It was a relief he had never allowed himself to imagine. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of forgiveness, understanding, and shared pain. The years of silence, the invisible burden began to lift, even if only slightly. For both of them, it was a moment of connection and healing, a recognition that while the past could not be changed, it could be faced and acknowledged. After their conversation, Henry walked back through the fields, the sunlight now warming the earth. He thought about the town, about the people who had witnessed the accident in small ways, and about the way communities remember events that are difficult to understand. He realized that while the past could bring pain, it could also bring lessons. The accident had taught him patience, vigilance, and empathy. It had shaped him into a man who could see others' struggles and respond with care. And now, sharing the memory, he understood that the town, too, could grow from it. That evening, as Henry prepared dinner, he noticed neighbors walking past the ranch, pausing briefly to wave and chat. There was a subtle shift in the air, a feeling that perhaps the town, though unaware, was also carrying its own hidden burdens. The experience with Tommy had reminded Henry that pain, when faced openly, could lead to understanding, connection, and even healing. He thought about the words he had whispered to himself so many times. "It still stings there." The sting was real, yes, but it was not permanent. With courage and honesty, it could be acknowledged, shared, and transformed. Henry spent the rest of the night reflecting. He thought about his own life, about the choices he had made, and about the quiet influence he had on the town. He realized that confronting pain was not a weakness, it was a form of strength. The journalist's questions, the visit to Tommy, and the reflection on years gone by had opened a door that he had long kept closed. Beyond it lay the possibility of understanding, for himself and for others. As he finally lay down to sleep, Henry felt a subtle sense of peace. The past was still there and it still stung, but the sting no longer weighed him down entirely. He had begun the process of facing it, sharing it, and accepting it as part of his life story. And with that, Henry knew that he was ready to take the next step, to bring this story, quietly but fully, to the town that had long admired him but never truly known him. In the days that followed, Henry continued his work on the ranch with a renewed sense of purpose. Each morning he walked through the fields, checking fences, tending cattle, and observing the small details of life around him. But now his work carried an added meaning. It was not just about maintaining the ranch. It was about living honestly, carrying the past with openness, and allowing the lessons learned to guide him forward. And in every rustle of leaves, in every distant call of a bird, Henry felt a quiet reminder. Life is fragile, memory is powerful, and understanding can heal even the deepest wounds. The days after Henry's visit to Tommy were quiet, but inside him, a storm of thoughts was brewing. He had faced part of the past, but the part that weighed heaviest, the town's understanding, still remained. Cedar Creek was a place where everyone knew everyone else, but few knew the truth of his life beyond the ranch. The accident with Tommy had been a shadow over Henry's heart for years, a silent burden he had carried alone. Now, after speaking with Tommy, he realized that if the town was to truly understand, he needed to speak openly, to share the full story that had shaped him, his life, and in many ways the lives of those around him. Henry spent several mornings walking the fields, thinking about how to approach it. It was not an easy decision. He knew that sharing the story would not be simple. People might be shocked, angry, or saddened. Yet he also knew that hiding the truth had kept him from living fully, and perhaps it had kept others from understanding him, and even themselves. He realized that the first step toward honesty was courage, and courage, he believed, was something that came from the heart, not the mind. One afternoon, Henry decided it was time. He began by visiting a few close neighbors, people he trusted most. They were friendly, kind-hearted folk who had known him all his life. He invited them to the ranch one by one, offering them tea and a seat on the porch. At first he spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the cattle, the quiet rhythm of life. But slowly he shifted toward the deeper story he had carried. He spoke of Tommy, of the accident, and of the years of silent guilt he had endured. The neighbors listened in silence. Some nodded slowly, understanding in their eyes, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Henry continued, explaining not just the accident itself, but the emotions, the sleepless nights, and the constant worry that had followed him for decades. He told them about his efforts to protect the land and the children who visited, about how every fence he repaired and every pasture he watched was done with a care born of responsibility and remorse. When Henry finally paused, a hush settled over the porch. It was as if the wind itself had stopped to listen. One neighbor, a woman named Margaret, spoke first. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Henry, I had no idea. We all admired you, but we never knew how much you carried. Thank you for telling us." Others added their voices. Some admitted that they had sensed something heavy in Henry's demeanor over the years but had never pressed, thinking it was simply part of his quiet nature. Others recalled their own experiences with fear, loss, and regret, and found a connection in Henry's story. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted from tension to understanding. Henry felt a strange lightness in his chest, the kind that comes when a long-held burden is finally shared, acknowledged, and met with compassion rather than judgment. Word of Henry's story began to spread through Cedar Creek, first in whispers, then in conversations at the diner, in the general store, and along the dirt roads that connected the houses. People were shocked at first. They had known Henry as a quiet, dependable rancher, someone who rarely sought attention. The truth of the past, the accident, the pain he had carried, and his own struggle with guilt was new to them. But as they talked, a deeper understanding emerged. They began to see Henry not just as a man who worked the land, but as a man who had lived with courage, who had faced tragedy with quiet dignity, and who had chosen to continue caring for the community despite personal pain. Henry realized that sharing the story was not just about himself. It was about the town, too. Cedar Creek had experienced the accident in its own way. The adults had been concerned for Tommy. The children had been warned to be careful near the creek, and the memory had lingered like an unspoken shadow in conversations and quiet moments. By speaking openly, Henry allowed the town to revisit the past, to acknowledge what had happened, and to share in both the sorrow and the understanding that had been hidden for so long. One evening, Henry decided to take the final step. He invited the townspeople to a small gathering at the community hall. It was a modest space, with wooden floors and chairs arranged in neat rows, the walls adorned with old photographs and memories of the town's history. Henry stood at the front, the weight of his decision pressing on him, but also a sense of calm he had not felt in years. One by one, the townspeople arrived, curious and cautious, unsure of what to expect. When the hall was full, Henry began to speak. His voice was steady, though there was a tremor of emotion beneath it. He told the story from the beginning, recounting the accident with Tommy, the fear, the guilt, and the years of silent reflection. He spoke not just of the event, but of the lessons he had learned, the importance of vigilance, the value of empathy, and the strength that comes from acknowledging one's own mistakes. He did not seek sympathy, nor did he make excuses. He simply spoke the truth honestly and openly. At one point Henry paused, his eyes meeting those of the townspeople. He whispered, almost to himself but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't, it still stings there." The words hung in the air and the room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, understanding began to spread. People nodded, tears welled in eyes, and a few quietly murmured their own stories of pain and regret. The simple phrase captured the lingering hurt that had been shared, not just by Henry, but by everyone who had been touched by the events of the past. The gathering continued long into the evening. Stories were shared, memories revisited, and emotions expressed that had been buried for years. The town, which had always moved forward without fully confronting the past, now felt a sense of connection that was deeper than before. Henry watched quietly, realizing that by opening his heart, he had given others permission to do the same. The hall, once a place of ordinary meetings and events, had become a space of healing, understanding, and shared humanity. After the gathering, as people left and the hall grew quiet, Henry stepped outside. The night was clear, stars twinkling above, the air crisp and gentle. He walked slowly through the empty streets, thinking about the reactions he had seen, the conversations that had unfolded, and the sense of relief and peace that now accompanied him. He knew that some pain would always remain, that accidents cannot be undone and memories cannot be erased. But he also knew that by facing the truth, by sharing it openly, he had begun a process of healing that could touch the entire town. Henry returned to the ranch, the familiar field stretching before him under the soft moonlight. The land, which had always been his sanctuary, now seemed to reflect his own journey, steadfast, enduring, and ready to carry new growth. He tended to the cattle, repaired a broken gate, and walked along the fence line, feeling a sense of calm that had eluded him for years. The past still stung, but it no longer weighed him down completely. In the days that followed, Cedar Creek slowly absorbed the story. People spoke of it quietly, in kitchens, at the diner, and during evening walks. They shared their own experiences, found empathy for one another, and discovered that the town, like Henry, had been carrying hidden burdens. Conversations deepened, relationships grew stronger, and a new understanding settled over the community. It was a subtle shift, but a meaningful one, proof that honesty, courage, and openness could transform even the most difficult memories into opportunities for connection and growth. Henry continued his work on the ranch with a quiet determination. Each morning he rose early, walked through the fields, and observed the cattle, the trees, and the land he loved. But now his work carried an added sense of purpose. Every action, every step, every careful observation was a reminder of the strength found in honesty and the importance of facing life fully, even when it hurts. He understood that while the past could never be changed, it could be acknowledged, shared, and transformed into lessons for the present and future. And so, as the sun rose over Cedar Creek, casting golden light across the fields, Henry felt a renewed connection, not just to the land he tended, but to the people around him, the boy he had once feared for, and the town that had been quietly waiting for this moment of understanding. The past had stung, yes, but now it carried meaning, depth, and the possibility of healing for everyone who had been touched by it. The days after Henry's gathering at the community hall were unlike any he had experienced in years. The town of Cedar Creek, usually calm and predictable, felt as though it had shifted slightly. Conversations that had once revolved around everyday matters, weather, crops, cattle, and local gossip, now carried a deeper tone. People spoke quietly but sincerely about feelings, regrets, and memories they had kept to themselves for decades. Henry noticed it on his walks to check the fences and tend the cattle. Neighbors he had greeted politely for years now paused to ask more personal questions, to share small moments of their own lives. It was subtle, but Henry felt a warmth spread through him. He realized that his decision to share the story had created ripples far beyond what he had imagined. The gathering had opened a door for honesty and reflection, and people were beginning to step through it. Some approached Henry directly, expressing gratitude for his courage. Others spoke indirectly, sharing their own experiences and, in doing so, validating the emotions he had revealed. Henry listened quietly, sometimes offering a nod, sometimes saying a few gentle words. He knew this was not about praise. It was about connection and understanding, the very things he had longed for during the years he carried the weight of Tommy's accident. One morning, Henry noticed Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived a few houses down the road, standing near the fence with her hands clasped. She had always been a kind but reserved neighbor, rarely speaking beyond polite greetings. Now, she called Henry over. "I wanted to thank you, Henry," she said softly. "I didn't know the full story before, and I see now how much you've carried all these years. I think we've all learned something about holding onto pain too quietly." Henry nodded, feeling a mix of relief and humility. "I didn't share it to be thanked," he replied gently. "I shared it because it needed to be said. I hope it helps us all understand each other a little better." Mrs. Thompson smiled, a faint tear glistening in her eye. "It already has." The impact of Henry's honesty spread across the town like sunlight breaking through clouds. Parents began to talk more openly with their children about fears and responsibilities. Friends who had drifted apart over small misunderstandings started reconnecting, realizing how fragile life could be and how important forgiveness was. People found themselves reflecting not only on Henry's story but on their own choices, their own regrets, and the quiet burdens they carried. Not everyone reacted in the same way. Some were hesitant, unsure if it was appropriate to speak of such matters openly. A few questioned whether it was necessary to revisit old memories. Henry understood this. He did not expect immediate acceptance from everyone. He only hoped that, in time, people would see the value of honesty and reflection, and slowly they did. Conversations that had been held in silence began to emerge. Neighbors shared stories of mistakes, accidents, and regrets, each person finding comfort in knowing that they were not alone. Tommy, now a young man, also became a part of this growing understanding. He spoke with others about his own experiences, not with blame or anger, but with empathy. He described the fear and confusion he had felt as a child, and how Henry's honesty had helped him see the accident from a different perspective. People listened, learning to view the incident as a shared experience rather than a source of judgment or shame. The town slowly embraced a collective understanding, seeing that everyone carried scars, whether visible or hidden, and that acknowledging them could lead to connection rather than division. Henry continued to lead by example. Each day he worked on the ranch, tending the fields and the cattle with his usual diligence, but now his actions carried a deeper significance. The care he put into the fences, the attention he gave to every animal, the patience he showed with visitors and neighbors, it all became a living demonstration of responsibility, empathy, and reflection. People began to notice small changes in themselves as they observed him. They learned that even quiet, consistent efforts could make a difference, that compassion and integrity were shown through actions, not just words. One afternoon, Henry was walking along the edge of the pasture when he saw a group of children playing near the fence. Among them was Tommy's younger sister, who had grown up hearing bits and pieces of the story. She looked at Henry with curiosity, not fear, and asked him to teach her how to care for the cattle safely. Henry agreed, kneeling down to explain patiently. As he spoke, he thought of the years he had spent worrying, of the fears he had carried silently, and of the lessons learned from facing the past. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with trust and admiration. In that moment, Henry realized that sharing his story had created a bridge, not just between the adults in the town, but between generations, teaching lessons of responsibility, care, and understanding that would last long into the future. The sense of healing was not limited to the ranch. People began visiting one another more often, checking in, offering help and sharing experiences. Conversations at the diner became deeper, filled with empathy and understanding. In the small general store, neighbors discussed life and memory, and even casual greetings carried warmth and acknowledgement of shared human experience. The town, once bound by routine and simplicity, was now connected by honesty, compassion, and a newfound awareness of the impact of their actions and choices. Henry also noticed changes within himself. The long-held burden of guilt and regret that had once pressed heavily on his shoulders had lightened. He felt freer to express his emotions, to speak openly about fears, hopes, and lessons learned. He smiled more easily, laughed more often, and even allowed himself moments of reflection without the sharp sting of self-blame. Sharing the story had not erased the past, but it had transformed it into something meaningful, a source of growth rather than solely pain. Evenings on the ranch became a time of reflection and quiet joy. Henry would sit on the porch after a long day, sipping coffee and listening to the sounds of the town settling into night. The wind carried faint echoes of laughter, conversations, and the soft calls of cattle returning to the barn. He thought about the journey the town had taken, the initial shock, the questions, the conversations, and the growing understanding. He knew that healing was not instantaneous, that scars would remain, but he also knew that acknowledging them had created a foundation for empathy and connection that could not easily be broken. One particularly quiet evening, Henry received a visit from a group of townspeople who had once been skeptical about revisiting the past. They approached hesitantly, unsure how he would respond. Henry welcomed them warmly, listening as they shared stories of personal struggles, regrets, and lessons learned. For the first time, these neighbors were able to express themselves fully, without fear of judgment. Henry's openness had created a space where honesty was safe, where vulnerability was respected, and where shared experience became a source of strength. As the town continued to reflect and grow, Henry understood a deeper truth. Life was fragile, memory was powerful, and the act of facing the past could transform not only the individual but the community as a whole. The sting of old wounds would never disappear entirely, but it could teach empathy, patience, and resilience. And in Cedar Creek, these lessons were beginning to take root, creating connections that would shape the town for years to come. By the time winter arrived, the town had changed subtly but significantly. Conversations were richer, relationships deeper, and the shared understanding of life's fragility and the importance of honesty had woven itself into the fabric of everyday life. Henry continued his work on the ranch, tending to cattle, repairing fences, and walking the fields, but now he did so with a sense of purpose that went beyond mere duty. Each action, each gesture, each word became a reflection of the lessons he had learned, the story he had shared, and the connections he had helped nurture in Cedar Creek. In the evenings, as he watched the sun dip behind the hills and the town quiet down, Henry felt a profound sense of peace. The town had responded, not perfectly, but sincerely. People were talking, reflecting, and connecting in ways that had not been possible before. And he knew that the courage to share his story had sparked a transformation, not just within himself, but within everyone who had listened, reflected, and opened their hearts. The sting of the past still existed, but it no longer defined them. Instead, it had become a teacher, guiding the town toward empathy, understanding, and shared humanity. As winter settled over Cedar Creek, the town carried a subtle but noticeable change. The days were shorter, and the cold winds swept across the fields, yet inside the homes and hearts of the townspeople, a warmth had begun to grow. Henry walked through the ranch early each morning, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, feeling a sense of calm he had not known for decades. The story he had shared, the accident with Tommy, and the years of silent struggle were now part of the town's shared history. And that shared understanding had begun to heal old wounds in ways Henry had never imagined. Henry knew that healing was not a single moment. It was a process. The conversations that had started in the community hall continued in small ways every day. Neighbors checked in on one another, friends met more often, and people spoke more openly about their own regrets and fears. It was as if the story of the past had unlocked a quiet courage in others, encouraging honesty and vulnerability. Henry watched these subtle changes with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that his courage to speak had set something in motion that would last long after the seasons changed. One afternoon, Henry decided it was time to revisit a part of the past he had avoided for years, the spot where Tommy had fallen near the creek. The winter sunlight reflected off the frozen water, and the fields looked peaceful, almost untouched by time. Yet Henry remembered the fear, the panic, and the weight of guilt he had carried that day. He knelt by the edge of the creek, placing a hand on the frozen ground, feeling a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. It was sorrow for the pain caused, but gratitude for the lessons learned and the people who had been part of the journey of healing. Tommy arrived shortly after, walking quietly through the field. He had asked to join Henry, sensing that this visit would be important. Together they stood in silence for a few moments, letting the sounds of the creek and the wind fill the space between them. Tommy spoke first, his voice steady but soft. I understand it differently now, Henry. I was scared that day, yes. But I see how much you cared, how much you've carried, and how hard you've worked to make things right, not just for me, but for everyone. Henry felt a lump in his throat. I never meant for it to happen, he said quietly. But I've learned that facing it instead of hiding it is the only way forward. I hope it helps you too, Tommy. Tommy nodded, a small smile crossing his face. It does. It really does. The two men spent the afternoon walking along the creek, remembering small details of that day, not with anger or blame, but with reflection and understanding. They talked about the mistakes made, the lessons learned, and the importance of caring for one another. It was a moment of reconciliation, a bridge between past pain and present understanding. For Henry, it was also a moment of release, a chance to let go of the heavy burden he had carried for so long. When they returned to the ranch, they found the townspeople gathered nearby. Word had spread that Henry and Tommy would be revisiting the site of the accident, and some had come to witness the quiet act of reflection. The townspeople watched from a distance, feeling the weight and significance of the moment. In that quiet gathering, there was no need for words. Everyone understood the journey that had taken place, the fear, the guilt, the courage, and finally, the healing. Over the next few weeks, Henry noticed small acts of kindness and connection that seemed to ripple out from the ranch. Neighbors offered help without being asked. Children played together under the watchful eyes of adults, and conversations in the diner became deeper, filled with empathy and understanding. The town was learning to carry the past with honesty, acknowledging its sting but also its lessons. And in the center of it all, Henry remained quietly present, a symbol of courage, resilience, and the power of sharing truth. One chilly evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink with the setting sun, Henry sat on the porch with Tommy. They sipped hot tea, the warmth spreading through their hands and hearts. The ranch looked peaceful, the cattle settled in the barn, and the field stretched endlessly, glowing in the fading light. Tommy broke the silence, saying, "I've realized something, Henry. It's not just about what happened to me that day. It's about how we live afterward, how we care for each other, and how we face our fears and mistakes." Henry smiled, feeling a quiet pride and satisfaction. "Yes, Tommy, that's exactly it. Life doesn't stop for mistakes or accidents. It's how we respond, how we choose to act, and how we connect with others that truly matters." The conversation lingered in Henry's mind long after Tommy left for home. He thought about the town, the families, and the generations that would continue to live and learn in Cedar Creek. The story he had shared, the honesty he had embraced, and the courage to face the past had left a legacy that went beyond himself. It had become part of the town's heart, a reminder that even the deepest pain could be transformed into understanding, empathy, and growth. In the following weeks, the town came together in new ways. There were small gatherings at homes, shared meals, and moments of reflection and gratitude. People spoke of the lessons they had learned from Henry's story, from the courage it took to face guilt and fear, and from the strength found in forgiveness and reconciliation. The accident that had once been a source of fear and sorrow had become a shared memory that connected the community in unexpected ways. Henry continued his work on the ranch with the same diligence as always, but now his labor carried a deeper significance. Every fence repaired, every animal cared for, every field tended was a demonstration of responsibility, integrity, and empathy. Children who had once watched him in awe now learned not only the practical skills of ranch life, but also the lessons of patience, understanding, and courage. Henry had become more than a rancher. He had become a living example of resilience and quiet leadership. Winter gradually gave way to early spring. The snow melted, revealing green shoots pushing through the thawed earth. The fields came alive again, and the town flourished in its own quiet ways. Henry watched as families walked together along the paths he once traversed alone, as children laughed and played under the trees he had once climbed with Tommy, and as neighbors offered help without hesitation. The town had not only healed, it had grown stronger, bound together by honesty, courage, and the shared recognition of life's fragility. One afternoon, as Henry repaired a fence near the edge of the pasture, he saw Tommy approaching, carrying a small bundle. Inside was a photo of the ranch from years ago, taken on a day when the sun had shone brightly, and the air had been filled with laughter. Tommy handed it to Henry, saying, "I wanted you to have this." A reminder that life goes on, and that even the hardest days can teach us something meaningful. Henry looked at the photograph, memories flooding back, not with pain but with appreciation. He saw the faces of the past and the promise of the future. He understood that the story he had carried and the courage to share it had created a legacy far greater than himself. It had touched hearts, healed wounds, and inspired others to face their own fears and regrets with honesty and courage. As evening fell, Henry walked back to the farmhouse, the warm light from the windows casting long shadows across the fields. He felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that the town, the families, and even himself had begun a journey of understanding and connection that would last for generations. The sting of the past still existed, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it had become a teacher, guiding the town and himself toward empathy, courage, and shared humanity. Henry sat on the porch one last time as the sun disappeared behind the hills, taking a deep breath of the crisp evening air. He thought of Tommy, the townspeople, and the journey that had brought them all to this point. Life, he realized, was fragile and unpredictable, but it was also full of opportunity for healing, for connection, and for growth. He understood that by facing the past, sharing the truth, and opening his heart, he had created a ripple effect that would continue far beyond his own life. In the quiet of the night, the ranch stood as a symbol of resilience, courage, and hope. The town of Cedar Creek had learned that even the deepest wounds could be faced and transformed. And Henry, the quiet rancher who had carried the weight of years in silence, finally felt the freedom of knowing that truth, honesty, and courage could heal not only himself, but the hearts of everyone around him. And so life went on, gently, steadily, and with a new sense of meaning. The sting of the past remained as it always would, but it no longer held power over the town, the families, or Henry himself. Instead, it had become a part of their shared story, a story of pain, courage, understanding, and ultimately healing.